Hello everyone, today we talk about sin, salvation, penitence between the 8th and the 9th century, mostly with examples from Western Europe, Northwestern Europe, mostly Anglo-Saxons, but not all, right? This is a topic I already addressed in even some of my earliest videos back in the day. I made, for example, one on the penitentials, right? And also especially in relation with warfare, bloodshed, like regulation of violence, the peaces and truces of God at Similia, right? This is not exactly the same time of the latter, but you know what I'm talking about, because we observed how fundamentally this regulation had always existed, and even though we have, of course, appreciated often the incredible level of violence, apparently, for what we think, at least in the way we have been removed, at least in a certain cultural, for those of us who have a certain cultural background with that sort of direct evidence, it's something left in the past and or to other countries, etc. But let's say our world was pretty violent, not just a very short time ago, but it was normally violent for a very long time. And say here I do not digress on, of course, on the philosophical and scientific consideration about the fact that it's not that we are intrinsically less violent than we were before, but the way we enact violence is different. It's done at different levels, etc. I made a video about Pinker's work that, as you know, is that guy is claiming that, because I was asked specifically, what do you think about this guy? He claims that we live in the best time ever, and yeah, that's technically true, but it's not that it cannot revert to something extremely violent otherwise. Of course, the conditions that you can identify that brought to some, it's not, of course, that that guy's work is debatable in many ways, but let's say it's something that eludes from at least today's topic, because we're not talking violence just per se, but obviously realizing that what we would appreciate in these times is not, say, the story of guys going to sin and make penitence, etc., just out of, I don't know, and especially for the cases that we know of mere, I don't know, you cheated on somebody or you stole somebody. I mean, part of it can be, but the bigger deal, the ones that we see documented more often, are of course so important, for example, from an economical point of view, to be quite political and social at the same time. We will observe it, and also military, also violence, bloodshed. And these centuries are fascinating because, as you know, Western Europe had been Christianized by this point, yet the essence, let's say, of that world did remain significantly violent, and especially, say, rooted culturally in this idea that the man, right, he who rules society, etc., must primarily be a warrior, right? Over time, this was, of course, also this time, in previous ones, it was understood that the institutions, that rulers, that the hierarchy was invested with different degrees of responsibility, and in fact also of militarization and capacity to enact a certain type of violence as a political instrument. But it was also a world that really looked still very individualistically at the prowess of warriorism, even can say, so something beyond the mere, okay, let's try to find, say, necessarily the most effective solution. Just let's consider that any affront to somebody's honor must be washed in blood, and so on. And I think you can all relate, when if you haven't been to any sort of legal issue whatsoever, that of course the first reaction would be, but I think it's right to do this. But if that was going on, it would be everything would be probably more complicated to handle overall. So if anything, we have to be aware of the logic behind that order, and admitting that we are also often say, devoid of the rationale and the understanding and the intelligence, responsibility, and farsightedness that is necessary to avoid problems in that regard. And life is always going to be imperfect in many ways that we have to deal with, right? And also be grateful for what we have. In a sense, this is what today's video is about, given that sin and salvation there are, of course, we have to make the effort at least to contextualize this information in the 9th century, so not in times that are so immediately close to us in terms of references. Every time I make these videos about Christianity, not just I realize that people watch less, but I'm not sure I think they do, because I'm not sure they understand actually what Christianity is in the first place. It's difficult in today's world that has, especially in the last generations, basically established in a sort of hegemonic fashion that religion is the source of all evil, or it's something inherently wrong and bad, and everything opposite to it is in fact the actual salvation. Well, look at what's happening in the world in a subjective fashion, and realize that yes, there is no doubt that civilization has brought us to the best possible time, but that people are fundamentally unhappy, and not necessarily because of civilization in itself, but because they are not able to handle civilization, which is the most rational way of ordering the world, but that also requires some spiritual qualities that are more primitive at the core, and shouldn't in fact be dismissed as archaic, so outdated, or even contrary to this logic. Imagine just living in a time like the 8th or the 9th century, right? Especially when the Vikings were starting to roam around, where the states you lived in fundamentally were barely such, and much of your living experience was literally being there out on your own, which is sort of the reason why eventually we built something that could protect us to some more functional degree. So this is also a time of Christianization at the same time, where many people that are also Christians themselves, say born and raised in a Christian context, would baptize themselves just later. And the Eden were out there, and they were not even such strange or outsider figures as we may think. Western Europe was essentially Christianized for quite a long time, but in the fringes and sort of in the periphery or the lower level, of course, people were formally Christian, but still not quite realizing what that practically meant. And of course, they integrated that with other beliefs that varied even to some degree. This is not today's topic, but it's also an interesting one we have to come back on. Always realizing that it was fine, even for a Christian world, to know that most peasants, say, didn't have much of a theological education. So I suppose, as you know, I've been quite vocal about this throughout Schwerpunkt, that it doesn't even make a proper sense to distinguish, say, pagan gods from or pagan god, right? We should remove a bit the concept of polytheism existing as an actual, say, plurality of deities that were not actually what we could even observe in the Trinity, or even in fact in the single most what we call monotheistic religions that are equally presenting us with this plurality, for example, of persons, etc. So this is also not what I'm going to digress on today, but it's still relevant, because we have been told often that, again, at some point the Christians arrived and everybody had to abandon their previous beliefs, and this happened, by the way, in a time of great crisis and whatever. Nobody really understands how this would have been possible if it hadn't been largely, as it was, in fact, a spontaneous system that also was not that repressive, simply because the power was not that powerful at that time. It was not that strong. So it was deeply ingrained, for example, in the time being that the relation with God was a beyond earthly life issue, right? There could be a possibility, of course, that your soul would basically dissolve itself after death. Essentially, that's the proper concept of hell for how it was originally conceived, and that eventually was sort of depicted in more graphic ways, just to scare. In fact, the people didn't really have quite another way of understanding that. But of course, the main point was that after that, soul was expected to reach a level in heaven, right? And to at least in the not even necessarily immediately. I'm not talking about the idea of purgatory that was already here and there even before Dante's sort of sublimation, but that was in function of the end time, right? Which is fascinating in many ways, because it was not just about the soul, of course, that had to be resurrected if you had been saved, but the flesh as well. So the somatic persistences, the same pagan cults that revolve around that, were basically the same thing that we see even later with the relics, with the idea that there is something remaining in this earth, even of the past ones. And I think it's a very beautiful thing, telling the truth. And it is obviously connected through us with all the rest of humanity. This is not necessarily an individualistic view of course you are responsible for yourself, but at the same time you're always responsible for anybody else in the world, because you have at least that spark of divinity, according to, of course, not just the Bible, but also the previous the entire religion had always existed. So this word novelty, and that's also how and why Christianity could spread, because differently from what have been, again, obsessively insisted on from an illuministic, say at least the bad side of the illuministic historiographical say acquisitions that also fueled later on in a nationalistic and or socialistic way the sort of the mass delirium that the average person was just a sort of passive element of this terrible elites right in the past. Of course, there was nothing but a continuity with the older beliefs, even when they were changing within themselves, because the core was the same. So this long-term perspective to the end time is also, again, a linear view and had always existed. You can have a cyclical view of time just as much as you can see a linear one. There's also the mythology that Christianity introduced, an eschatological view of linear time in history is nonsense, right? In antiquity, this was present literally in every religion. But aside from this, and to some degree, even those that insisted very much more on the cyclical elements, and eventually were mostly the Pelagian ones, it's also, in fact, the ones of the peasantry, the ones of the more connected with the earthly cycles. Again, it's obvious, right? The Apollonian, Uranian, heavenly religion, just something coexisting always without one another. It was a positive, but sort of for the greater purpose, right? Accomplishment of divine unity. And so this is also not what we're talking about today, but still it's important to keep in mind. And it is true that the spread of Christianity brought to an important social level of social control that actually already existed before, right? Witch hunting, etc. was already existing. It would continue well beyond the Middle Ages, and actually more outside Catholicism, that basically bailed out of that quite early in the Renaissance. because it just responded to certain local dynamics that had always been existing, and that unfortunately, I hate to, just to give you the appetizer, but not following on it, but there is some reference here and there. I have a pretty large history of Christianity playlist, as you know, but that's not. Let's say we'll deal with each of these things dedicated videos, and this social control was also required, right? Of course, there were communities that, at that point, in a political sense, would have liked to be more autonomous, but it turns out also that this is a time of great sort of power building, and that the world went in the opposite direction. So even in terms of the functionality of this local communities and their autonomy ambitions, as we've seen just the other day with the video on medieval Swabia, that had a hell of a sort of autonomistic history that turned out to become the center of the very empire attempting to centralize further, is quite eloquent. Now, fear of punishment and certainty of impending judgment combined had a great deterrent capacity, and they put, however, at the same time, great stress on expiation, because bad things happened, as always, especially in a world like this that is still largely unregulated, and so there's just attempting also through the Christian activity to become one of this kind, and in, again, very difficult times at a point. And this was, of course, one with belief that after death there was a process that the soul had to undergo if succeeding to pass to the other side successfully, to heaven right above properly. And that contemplated already the ideas of purgatory, right? A purification had to go through fire, and that was also to be could be a fire of complete death and dissolution if, in the case of the impure, of the damned, to those that instead would have not even properly made it to death. And this fire would have helped to revive. It was the same God, right? That's what actually the thing stands for. It's, if you look at the video on the path where fire of death blazes, you can better understand what that issue really is. So, confronting oneself with one's own sins, mistakes, and so showing people, right, how both the clergy and the laity had a necessity to improve themselves, to be better people, to make the world work successfully, still always requires an ideology of sin and atonement, right? You cannot really live without that. And of course, in a world like us, which we think to have some sort of abstract rights, but without apparently any duty of sort, or much less of that, is maybe difficult to appreciate. At least I think that my audience is pretty conservative oriented, so I guess that is an advantage in this understanding, but not only, don't get me wrong. So when we look at, say, very early times at this point, say the very beginning of the 8th century, right, you have the belief in purgatory already spreading. The very centers of, say, this irradiation were the monasteries, because of course almost the entire Western Europe had the Roman diocesan system. That is to say, the church, the diocese, the bishop is in the city, right? And then you have the parishes, you have the various, even of course, country parish churches, chapels, and so on. But monasteries were also a big deal, right? And they especially had not just a sort of identitary function, point of reference for the peasantry, but they were pretty connected through donations, through the same foundation, to lay circles that had, in fact, established them most of the time. And that had brought the monastic experience as also one that the rest of the world had necessarily to observe, because the monk, differently from what it's believed, was not really a recluse in absolute term, nor the monastery itself as a model could be. And we can look at the northerly fringes of Northumbria, even, that was by 700 AD, not exactly the single most Christian place that you can imagine. Why? Even before, of course, before Viking times, it was still it was a Christian country, don't get me wrong, but the perfection of these beliefs was, of course, much less than, say, the ones in southern Britain, and in parts of the continent, etc. In any case, we have this Anglo-Saxon Drithelm that had a monastic lifestyle. Telling the truth, he was associated with the monastery of Melrose. Right? We know this through Bede and his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum. He was a family guy, the so-called pater familias, right? And as such, and I think this is very interesting for understanding how people also before Christianity saw the duty, right, their religious duties, was the example, was the leader, was the head of the family, so the equivalent of the head of a clan, of a tribe throughout their hierarchy. So he was the one who had to give the example, to set the example, right? The Bible, as much as the other religions are existing, is where we're pretty clear about that. These people were thought to be leading the group, but also owning it to some degree, right? And so the relation was shaded, and their role was thus more important than the one of the individual members. Drithelm led a religious life within his own household, right? And he had we know again from Bede a glimpse of both purgatory and paradise. That had been the reason why he had decided at a point to tonsure himself and joining a monastery. He was a person who evidently cared about his own salvation, the one of his group, of his kin, and he was, of course, we cannot enter the mind of these people, especially just because nobody can, but even more because of the distance in time. But we know that he envisioned, for example, the souls of men tossed between raging fire and icy tempest in a valley that lay in front of the mouth of this stinking pit of hell that, of course, was the most terrifying place imaginable, and that, of course, looked at what was the ultimate destination of those who had not expiated their sins during their earthly journey, which contrasted definitely with instead a group of happy people on this fragrant sunlit plain that was in Drithelm, if you prefer, vision, laying just outside of the kingdom of heaven, because, importantly enough, this was not, it was understood how the end time was not there yet, and so nobody quite could simply enter the kingdom of heaven until the world was fully conquered and transfigured. So these people obviously had, let's say, they had managed to reach that status for which they had been positive to leave, to make their souls pass this first trial, right, fire during life and even part after it, and we're just laying next to heaven, ready for the second come of Christ, right? And being confident their soul would have, in fact, as immortal in that sense, would have participated to the greatest struggle against evil at the end time. And this was also, in fact, the same belief that laid, say, just for the places to the Valhalla and the Ragnarok, right? The souls of even of the fallen heroes. They are not just necessarily everybody who has died in battle, by the way. And this is what the Norse sagas were said pretty clearly, were not necessarily enough for the end time, for the Aesir to actually win over the forces of hell, right? So there was always, and this is what I think modern Christianity has somehow normalized in a more comfy but not challenging sense of our actions, right? This is not Christianity's fault. It's rather just a process that happened even through the same affirmation of Christianity, but from previous times, in pagan times, and more. And so even Christ's sacrifice is not entirely the reason why we can't be simply saved. Works do matter, right? And of course, after the Reformation, a part of Christendom thought that it was not the case. But it lays exactly in the realization that God is more like a condition that has to materialize itself in the world, because it is connected with part of the divinity that lays within us, right? And again, I'm not going to enter theological ground in this video specifically, because it's one, even if you look at some of the today's famous, let's say, biblical scholars and theologians, etc., this is not entirely sorted out, right? It is still a matter of personal opinion to some extent, or at least there is a direction, but there are still doubts about biblical exegesis, interpretation of certain passages, and so on, and one can't legitimately feel confused or uncertain, or may have this conscience scruple saying, but is it really what I'm looking at here? So this vision of the Drythelm is quite picturesque. It sort of captures for us, right, the beliefs and fears that helped shape people's conduct in Drythelm's time, right, early 8th century Northumbria. In Drythelm's story, there is so an angelic guide, very much like Beatrix for Dante, etc., that would guide and explain him, right, of this vision. The souls were being chastened by fire and ice as they had delayed, particularly confessing and repenting their sins until the very moment of their death. This is an interesting aspect which gets often misunderstood, because people think, well, but what's the deal with these guys? They just for some reason had forgotten to confess and repent of their sins. And if so, why? And this is the most important question, because as we will see with some examples, not everybody, let's say, every action brings to sin, but there is always a degree of error and a mistake in every action we make. But at the same time, we have to do as much as we can, and so in this sense, sinning as much as we can to some degree, at least, of functionality to what our greater good and better purpose is, in order for us to again push, right, to rise further our souls after death in the firmament. So this was accompanied with the aforementioned warrioristic ethos to some degree, the greater ruler, the greater warrior, etc., and how much they achieved. It was seen as, of course, God's blessing, because the idea that every practical accomplishment was a matter of imperial glory was still that simply believed to be the major accomplishment. My personal understanding of this is that it is correct, right? There are some theologians, historians of religions that go as far as saying, well, you don't really have to have practical material wealth, for example, to be to prove that if you have earned that, or you dispose of that, because in different ways you may have less mind in order to use it, but still having it has a meaning, because everything has a meaning in that sense. So there is an accomplishment in that, but there is also a way to cultivate yourself spiritually so that eventually you can make the difference in the world. So getting a type of wealth that is mostly the one that helps you live in spreading further this knowledge, this understanding. But this yet has to happen, right? Monks believed that their code of conduct would essentially allow them to commit the greatest sacrifice of all, and so being of such greater example for the community that imperium would have manifested automatically within it. And so imitating what Christ was doing, just in the perfect awareness of self-sacrifice, that had to be the one that would earn him, and not being conferred to him simply God's full glory, right? This is very, very often I'd say, overlooked, at least in even in Christian theology, that God is not really just vindicating Christ for his persecution and his killing, right? But is Christ that is actively winning that in the same concept of imperial glory that otherwise could have not ever been achieved. So it was not a passive idea, and that's why so many people believed, after all, that this is important if you consider that we are in the early Middle Ages, and that specific belief had died just, maybe half of a millennium ago, but the one that a single man could be the hero who would transfigure the world once again. So it was believed that there was a sort of messianic figure that could accomplish that, as just the great emperors and normally the great leaders were meant to do, right? That's all the issue of the empire and the papacy, and why these institutions were still there for a long time, because they truly embodied that necessity, that church and that Christian state within which, in fact, all can be rectified, right? And so there was a process that entailed given the sins that had been committed in your own life. And think about that, right? Because it's hard not to feel ashamed by the mistakes that we do. But do we ever atone for them? Do we ever... Because we must, of the time, turn our eyes, we distract ourselves, we say, well, okay, having done this has not really made me a better person to rely on to saying the very things I thought could be, but cannot. And so I'm just a good person after all, I'll go along with that. No, there is a deeper need of conscience analysis, we can argue, to eventually become a better person. I think this is particularly important as a concept. And so penitence, prayers, alms, fasts, masses, right, not only would help you personally, would help people living in the world right now, and people, of course, the people who are coming after you, but also those who have passed, right, and those that can finally reach heaven. And it's even difficult to simply draw a boundary between these and those who had been damned, because, say, the etheric dimension was still believed to be fed by these individuals. So the ultimate purpose was to transfigure the very darkest part of the abyss itself, and this is present within us as much in potential as much as the greatest light, and it's very often more the first than the latter. The vision that Bede describes from Drivehelm is the one of white-clad people. Just yesterday we were talking about the habit of the Teutonic, the Livonian, and the Dobrzhin knights that were, and also the Templars, by the way, that were quite jealous. Yesterday I forgot to tell that, but when the emperor and the papacy gave the latter especially the permission also to wear not just the white mantle but the white tunic, the Templars said, but that was our own prerogative. Yeah, okay, these guys are still some of the finest, and they have a black cross as opposed to the red one. But just for saying how this symbolism was so rooted vividly, and from how many centuries? This is almost half of a millennium, or actually around half of a millennium before that. Just to think from, you see, what I would like to stress is that these are not just Christian things per se, right? They are just the universal system of symbolism existing since ever, right? And these white-clad people were enjoying a flowery meadow. Who were these people? They were those who had died performing good works, right? Which may have actually been the case for military actions, right? And they had repented. Say they were not so perfect, but they had obtained a sort of higher status, so much so that the kingdom of heaven was already theirs by some degree. This is fascinating because they had gone a step further, and they were sort of the greatest trustees of God, so those who had practically achieved sainthood in a way. And here the boundaries again are just expressed literally, but of course theologically speaking there is a parallelism with that. It's not necessarily the same identical thing, but still. So when we look at Drivehelm and his contemporaries, we realize that good works, confession, and repentance of sin in life affected what happened beyond the grave. It's say stressing the cohesive sort of the trait d'union, the fact that all these things were not just a sum, but a chain, right? Something that led from a thing to another. It's important to stress. Because what this meant socially, as we will see now, was helping people to bond on the basis of these simple moral tasks that were, however, also very, very important for everyone involved. Because society could work better through that, simply. And giving that strength was needed to perpetuate the system. Christian religion demanded that daily affairs be conducted in accordance with the rigorous ethic of self-restraint and good deeds, which, of course, is all you need if you are a fallen as you are, in order to get yourself on the right track, which doesn't mean you're going to perfectly achieve. Otherwise you would be God yourself. But that helps saving the world itself. There was a very interesting system of private confession followed by penance that we have seen already in the videos about the penitentials, right? And this had been developed by the Irish monks in the 6th century. This was very rigid, by the way, and was also somehow eccentric to even the Anglo-Saxon and the continental tradition, just per se. The Irish monks were quite rigid. It's that Celtic, primitive Celtic, and brutal Celtic background, by the way, of militaristic culture and warriorism, and that had I made a video specifically on this sort of, brought these monks to challenge the very champions, right, that were thought to have some sort of magic power that was nothing about the actual empire, but that was seen as, however, performed in a tricky way that was just about that dimension. Also physicality that was not all with what was needed in terms of the spirit, because the spirit is superior to matter, right? You cannot have a Cartesian view splitting the two categorically. They're always compenetrating one another, but it's just spirit that can actually transcend matter, that can transfigure matter itself. So the spiritual preparation was more important. As notoriously, the Irish monastic rules were extremely harsh, also from a physical point of view, because the point was like, feel that means, right, and feel how close that bring you to suffering, and say the testing of your moral commitment to the truth, right? This has happened in so many other levels, including the same military ones that were even worse. But the idea is that you could not separate this moment of absolute sort of inner effort from the broader accomplishment. And true tariffs of penance, graduated according to the severity of each sin and repeated each time another sin was confessed. Confessors could help the penitent cancel out his or her ill deeds. This was done at high level, and it was highly regarded because the individuals that were regulating such confessions were trustworthy, were deemed to be people who had practiced that actual craft, right? So that if we think of wizards, we think automatically in terms of contemporary cultural reference, oh my god, it must be so fascinating, right? It might have been, who knows? But if you say they were Christian monks, you say, well, okay, but it's the boring part, right? They're actually the same thing, right? Even if there was a borderline, of course, danger of being heterodox in the way this would be achieved, but it wasn't sort of manualistically distinguishable sometimes, because the greater the good and the greater the risk to do evil, because that it's what spurs you eventually to action, as we were saying before, and at the highest level of the elites, both lay and ecclesiastical, that from greater responsibility also greater risks derive. The Aquitanian noblewoman Dwoda urged her young son William to offer his own true confession in privacy, with sighing and with tears, and to devote fully one half his time to penance and reparation. This was quite intense, right? But the Liber Manualis, that was literally the work quoting here, is this: Da illis ut melius nostri, tuam occulta cum suspirio et lacrimis veram confessionem. So this was understood, of course, for an elite that whose children were meant to be professional warriors, and so, good sin would always have something that this mother would feel like, it must be terrible to go through. Just the nightly training, what this in cliché you have, or in the parts of the these knights are called angels that kill everything they touch, right? Referring to the knights. So that's why this intense demand, this intense exhortation. Alcuin reminded Count Wido that God never spurned penance, however short its duration if done with true contrition, and there was still however, no possibility to repent after that. So our earthly journey is not really accidental for the simple reason that it's us who have posed ourselves in the condition of a fallen kind. Right? The idea is that all this is not happening because some strange ruler decided that we have to be a fallen kind. It's our own sin that makes us so. Right? There is a standard sin, original sin in fact, that does not derive from somebody having done it and simply us descending from them, but the fact that by having done this, humanity has sunk from divinity to itself. Let's say mankind has sunk from divinity to humanity. And so we are immediately responsible for that, because if we were better, we would immediately transfigure back. So it's not an unfair trial put on us. It's really what we can't basically even understand to be able to do anymore, and how to, which is terrifying, because we do live in a society that effectively doesn't care about this anymore. Why? Because say, well, we are just the way we are now, right? So there is not much that you can do to improve, and you shouldn't be so harsh on yourself after all for the faults that you make. But the question is, what can happen if you can be the best person you can be? Because that's a purely moral attainment that, however, is going to have a practical result immediately in reality. We all have, right? Think about everything you do every day. It has a moral cause and a practical consequence. And just imagine you can tend towards divinity and perfection. And what else but love can move this towards your kind, your family, your children? Like it's it is really a duty. And we are sort of sorting out how to do that, because also Christianity came along in a moment in which this had apparently, which humanity had realized that they couldn't quite transfigure very much anymore. The age of the me-gods and the me-man was over, right? The ecumenic empire had failed to a degree, and people had been exhausted and had not been able to replace that moral capacity that is, however, possible to do, because it's infinitely available in God. And so what happened to us? Right? Why do we have to make penitence? Well, exactly for this reason. Right? I think it's extremely important to stress. Of course, the afterlife was, again, and so what? It's not just a place, but it's an end, right? Like the end time. There was an earthly reflection of this moral state of affairs, for which ecclesiastical discipline, clerical ritual, etc. were to discipline, at the best of the spiritual insight, what politics and society had to do. So again, it was never felt just as the individual guys, but we're also more documented about them, because at the end of the day, politics was exemplifying the issue, right? Who is that is leading us, right? Where is the sacrality of the ruler ended up? And of course, we know a lot not about individual monks, but these were mostly contemplative reflection about something that they did themselves, but that are so because they're simply written down, and so with all the sort of meaning that we have to try to dig out, to dig from. So accounts of sinners hastening to holy men and priests, for example, to confess, suggest that ecclesiastical teaching on the need of penance was really taken to heart, because it's your life, it's your thing. It doesn't come out like a standard pack, like do this and that, and you're done, right? Because nobody can, right? But if you look at every individual person, you can look at essentially what's wrong with them specifically. So what's the better path for them to improve? There is an interesting survival, the vernacular ordinance, for hearing confession and administering penance points in a similar direction, right? That basically were some lists of so quite, in fact, that they are in vernacular is remarkable, because it shows how to the everyday person it would go, right? Also because the leaders were just maintaining somebody else or clienterly, and so it was a matter of not, again, just personal concern. The point, however, was also that there was an attrition between the priests and at least the expectation that, say, the actual voluntary cooperation of the laymen, because of what we said before. Like, you can't quite, like, just imagine you're a miles at this point. You're fighting your entire life practically. That's all you do. You spill blood and whatever. The way you are mentally designed is an eternal contradiction. We've seen it. It brings you closer to the struggle with God. It's even a positive thing, right? The problem was, however, also knowing how to fix your, say, issues that at some point in everybody's life get sort of art nesting. They're rooted. That's how your personality takes on its character, and it's difficult even to accept it, to find out, or to even understand what your deal is, right? The priests could ask for lay cooperation, or saying, look, you did something terrible, you must fix that. But it's obvious that if you go to a person and say that normally, they're in dismay or disbelief, or they're even hostile, right? They reject you because of that. And this happens every day, right? So one 9th century bishop admitted, for example, the problems he had encountered in making penance an effective disciplinary tool. For example, Isaac of Lang, we're talking about essentially the mid to end 9th century, commented that he had decided to take action because the essentially idleness, right, of those who were uncooperative, and even their complaints about pastoral solicitude, so those who said, you remember that you have sinned, you must make up for that, would bring even to, of course, damage to the entire society. There were wicked men that insolently asserted that all things which are said for their own improvement or security are actually not valid. That essentially what the priests were saying, in order to save themselves, was not correct, that they didn't have a clue. And this is a very interesting, say, complaint, because first of all shows how honest, after all, this Frankish bishop was saying. These people do not fundamentally believe in what we tell them they have to do in order to save themselves, to at least repent for their own sins, that they, of course, will, if going undone, will, of course, cause them much more problems, and we are collectively, and we as shepherds are also responsible for, primarily. And at the same time, you have the same layman's concern for that, right? It's not that they are saying that they simply didn't want to do it, right? They were saying that fundamentally they believed that they couldn't quite accomplish what they did. Of course, there was a lot of politics behind this, because if you look at the Missi Dominici, the sense that bishop and count were somehow cooperating but also competing, at times you can understand why these problems, especially in a place like France at this point, was torn apart by civil wars, the Viking invasions, and so a world was sort of collapsing, mostly as we've seen because of the even the connivance of these counts towards the external invaders for reasons of their own aggrandizement. So we're not talking about just some random reasons that are thrown out here for complaining. There was a lot about that which fundamentally did not simply could not simply go away just by good intention, but that was recognized likely by the same laymen that were concerned, in fact, with that same effectiveness. That is to say, we can even make penance, but is that really effective as even just as a tool of discipline, and or for this violence to stop? Because from their perspective, they would have seen it also. We must first establish our own order in order to try to curb the others at the same time. So some of these difficulties lay also in the strategies that people devised to fulfill the letter, but not the spirit, right, of a penitential sentence. There were people, of course, that would simply keep doing the same thing they had always been doing, even after the penitence. That was, as you know, null if not much if this, let's say, sin had been repeated, but if it was carried out without actual atonement and contrition, which is just like sacraments are not valid if you do not actually do anything about them. The priest can officiate that, but it's not really doing it. The action of the priest is valid, but what you make with your own soul is a different thing, right? This is also very misunderstood in the history of Christianity. Penitentials most commonly imposed as sentences fasting for a specific duration. It had to be for actually purifying. Even after bloodshed, there was the sense that you had really to get rid of even of the soma that had brought to that from that to happen. You had to change as a person, right? In fact, it could even be for many years long for the most serious offenses. By the mid of the 8th century, the Irish practice of commuting and penance had also become quite common, right? In the 747 Anglo-Saxon Council of Closho, there was an invectivement even against this practice, because it was thought that say commutation enabled a penitent to avoid the inconvenience of fasting by giving alms or donating land to the church, right? In part, it was also good, right? Because you understand that you have more power to do good, but is it all, right? Is it really how the thing could really work in the best of intention? The alternative was someone else being hired, literally, to perform the fast on the penitent's behalf, or a priest paid to say masses. This was, especially the former, seems to us pretty strange, because it's if a guy has to make the penitence for his own sins, what about this other one who was hired for it? It was seen in to sort of, yes, as a sort of tribute, right, to the church, rather than a full expiation and of the sin, or even at that point of a concern for the person. This excluded, you see, the aforementioned individual role in the collective salvation. In 829, you have at the Council of Paris the correct administration of penance that should have been, in fact, correcting these problems, that cautioned priests who determine the duration and nature of penance according to the penitent's pleasure, right? As a sort of, well, okay, I will make you this gift, right? Or I will absolve you, even if you're not really that guy. And so maybe this priest was ordained by a bishop that was part of the family of that same guy, right? It would have not been uncommon, actually, and especially at the highest levels, right? Because, of course, here we're talking about, we've seen Hincmar of Rheims talking, the Council of Paris just talk about roughly the same age in videos about Lotharingian warfare. And we can appreciate how Hincmar was simply denouncing hashmoney, right? Given to priests to say, okay, well, absolve my sins, so that publicly we will show that I have done the thing. And after all, isn't it that all what you want in practice? The church was a powerful landowner. It had a lot of course, of immunities and privileges. So, in many ways, it was still positive to be able to make leverage on the layman, and not only in this way, right? Because at least the church would benefit partly from that, but there was a risk of contamination, so of corruption of, say, spiritual standards. There were efforts in this regard to reduce the inconvenience presented by the penitential sentence, springing from the most obviously deeper concern about the actual fate of one's soul, which was coupled with a reluctance to allow clerical stipulations to circumscribe every action. There are some aspects of people conduct that required to regulate sexual behavior. When we look at the penitential codes of these centuries, the sexual misconduct had a specific category of offense that sort of stands out by itself. There was, of course, a sort of nearly monastic morality required, right, expected from laymen, right, which, of course, was quite unattainable. Even here, the purpose is the extreme, is the absolute. It's the idea that yes, there is a duty to procreate, but this is aiming, in fact, much higher than just the sexual enjoyment per se. So it's not the thing in itself that is wrong, especially when it can lead to actual births, but it is not to become a distraction, right, for in your life, just like basically any other action didn't have to be. Right, so monasticism wasn't really asking but just a spiritual training, as opposed to, eventually you have to go out there and do something, right, but you don't have to think that that something is just a habit that you can use every time you want just for satisfying your immediate physical needs. So this is a very interesting topic because it is it's perhaps one of the most difficult things for us to understand nowadays, not just much because of the definitely excessive sexual liberty that exists, but let's say because, right, we have properly severed the realization that, in fact, it's not talking about sex specifically, but any sort of kind of immediate pleasure satisfaction, if done for the purpose of itself, simply saying, I would feel more fulfilled to do that, but it does not bring anywhere, like just having sex but without any interest in procreation, for example. Well, that is a severe problem. It's to say you have this superpower fundamentally to create a new life, and you don't care to do so. Just enjoy the physical pleasure. So there was a debate, right, within the same church, because certain clerical reformers and legislators were definitely radical in this. They said that the same conjugal sexuality was, remember, this is before the Gregorian reform, so technically priests, say, not normally had children, but they could, and it would, say, especially in many areas of Europe, it was not really a big deal, right? It was even a sort of national character, and the idea was that this was spreading, however, excessively, right? And here, one misunderstands it. They think that we're talking just about the average priest, right? Here we're talking about abbots, for example, that were even illegitimate children of some Carolingian ruler that were abbots, but were living essentially just because they had the title as a possession, but they were actually, because of all the privileges and so on, but they fought just and lived and loved like any other layman. And so the problem at that point was not just the layman, but say, what about these guys, say, setting first the example, if they are the abbots, that should exactly provide with that monastic model. And this is an important issue, of course, because especially in Frankish world, and say also more in the north, the boundary was so blurred that it represented a real cultural problem. Consider that the church was structuring itself definitely in an ever more unitary sense. So the various councils, now especially that the Carolingian Empire had been established, the the Romanity of it revived, and so on. There was an ever more ecumenic, universal dimension to these assemblies, and so you couldn't quite simply get rid of that, so to speak. That simply, and the idea was, say, hitting not just this model, but reflecting also on the broader human scale of this. That is to say, we must teach people to live their sexuality in a way that really fulfills them as men and women, and not, let's say, very, especially in the elites that were quite mixed in a broader clanic somatic idea, right? Be so promiscuous at some point. This was always a problem. But it got down to the theoretical root. Why should we do it just for these people, not for everyone? Right. Some even began to see the marriage as incompatible with participation in the worship of the Christian community, when it was not intended for procreation, which was a big deal. By the way, women's physiological cycles, we talk about menstruation, pregnancy, breastfeeding, etc., was, for example, considered as a moment in which you could not have sex with her, which, as we know, is something you can't bypass, and that they would. So for us, again, it's somehow difficult to understand, specifically in this. Plus, the very important aspect was also the various times of the liturgical calendar. As you know, approaching Lent was a period of purification, etc. So you find these issues actually debated even by the laymen, right? There were certain Carolingian rulers that literally legislated before a military expedition, say, before, say, when Lent approaches, try to avoid burning churches and committing adulteries, which I think is quite telling of the problems that occurred, because the problem was not much that it was such a violent society that, as we know, would remain always in many ways, also in the later centuries. And so these things regularly happened, but it rather shows how sensitive these very people who committed these crimes, exactly for that, were, in general, as a society, towards the same, and towards especially the let's say, the fear, of course, that these sins would ruin the entire enterprise for everyone. Because this is what literally the problem was, that if a community sinned, somebody in the community sinned, the community and the world was taking on its shoulders that sin, right? So it's quite an issue, right? And historians have also debated whether there were any demographic causes or consequences for such restrictions, especially when they became so stringent, right? It's obvious that this seems more like a social issue, right? A reason of misconduct in general. But it's obvious that when you look at 50 days of intercourse a year for a Christian couple, well, this goes, if you consider what a clinical psychologist would tell you, probably it's good to have sex for a couple, like to make love twice at least a week, and this can vary from people to people. Like people need multiple times a day, every day. Others maybe just much less, even in the week or beyond. So this is of course, a matter that there is a sort of golden section here. But if you calculate overall, we're talking about, yes, once a week, right? And it's and just having intercourse, by the way. So this can count multiple times in that same day, and it may even have some sense, right? But it doesn't seem necessary to be calibrated with those biological needs per se, right? At least this is unknown. You should never be, let's say, surprised to know how deep this concerns were for practical purpose. And so that's also the reason why we can't just make it a biological issue, even though, of course, it had to do with that. It's also difficult, in fact, to understand how were these rules of conduct observed practically, right? Were they so harsh, relatively harsh, because they were not observed, which speaks of a failure normally in legal history, or did people actually care, and they were quite concerned actually about the issue, because they really had an idea of what could or couldn't be done. Jonas, Bishop of Orléans between 818 and 843, so quite a time in Carolingian history of greater expansion of the empire, realized that many people, of course, ignored injunctions to refrain from sexual activity before marriage. First of all, that was the main issue. And since nuptial masses were reserved for virgins, by the way, he noticed that they thereby denied themselves the chance of having their marriage blessed in church, as we know from the Institutione Laicale, that is one of his works. So when we look at the church here, we have to understand that we're teaching non-stop, like they were to do so from the top of the hierarchy down to the various elements of priests, confessors for individual people, right? And of course, again, here we don't have to think that every, say, the most humble of the peasants was taken care of so much spiritually as the top, say, high nobility. But it was still a pretty consistent job, also because the church was, as we've seen, pretty big, right? They had a lot of land, had a lot of people working for them, etc. There were interesting sanctions as well that were quite harsh, right? In case especially of flagrant flouting of the codes of sexual ethics, bishops who attended the General Assembly at Epernay in 846, for example, agreed on the fact which at the Frankish, let's say, eyes, right, burning alive a man indulged in bestiality with a mare during the holy season of Lent was an appropriate punishment. This is objectively interesting because you have a case of literal zoophilia in the holiest season of the Christian calendar, and of course the fact that this guy would be burnt alive shows you how, after all, community did care, right? Because if the church had simply said, okay, well, let's punish this person, and they didn't have notoriously the faculty of criminal punishment, right? The priest, the clergy in general, not even bishops had, right? They had to ask the count, right, that could carry that sentence out. But the fact that this was done, right, and at least it was established that was a proper punishment, is still striking, right? It shows how relevant this issue seemed. There was a general disregard in any case, too, as we pointed out. It's obvious that people were concerned with their own salvation, so they would attempt to order their own lives appropriately on their own, right, and or at least with the consonance, of course, of their spiritual guides, but still in a way that could be, again, pretty personalized. In August of 822, Louis de Pius was publicly receiving the complaint by Northild about some dishonorable things going on between herself and her husband Agamber, and the bishops who to the emperor referred the case decided that they were not really going to discipline it, right? It was outside their competence, and they should not be referred to married lay people to resolve this issue rather than the spiritual authority, which is somehow interesting because it shows that there were powerful laymen that were fundamentally not really responding anyway, right? Were too much even from the bishops to be disciplined in a way. At least, again, there was not much could practically be done. Gerald of Aurillac, that had a pretty intense, and I made a video about him. This was a very interesting saint. He had this horror for the carnal obscenity, right? So it's not necessarily again a normal sexual life. Consider how conservatives say marital life, of course, because it's the only circumstances which it's of course allowed, right? How conservatives today are debating, for example, about the sin of porn as a whole, right? To you, it may not seem a big deal. You say, well, but it's not all bad, and it's not even the thing itself. It's how much you may dehabituate yourself from a regular sexual life because, say, you get addicted to porn. Well, Gerard de Aurillac was saying that these nocturnal illusions were haunting him, so he bathed in a cold water by shedding tears of penance, right? And this, of course, there is all in a geography about the saint who was a warrior at the same time. And there are interesting parallelisms there between the chivalric code and the this sort of monastic behavior, because as we've seen, they really stem from the same place in some circumstance. And say it would be interesting to digress how, for example, the sexual activity of a warrior in the those beast warrior brotherhoods was considered in function, for example, of the life of the Zippe, because there was evidently a person, there was some divide there that could not be crossed. So the question is, what does really Milas do? What is that he has to fight, and fight what exactly? Right, Geraldo Boyac is a very interesting saint. I made a video, one of my very early videos were about him, because he eventually embodied the sense that even a lord could be seen as a saint. Even those who spilled blood regularly were, however, conferring the community that sense of protection, because literally what was happening towards late Carolingian era and beyond is that the population required these heroes to stand out to protect them from the invaders, from other rapacious wolves like other lords, and from themselves, right? So there was a sort of sublimation of what these knights had to be, and a bit all that chivalric ideal that we were talking about before. Virginity was one of the let's say, the sense of the warrior has to reorder the world, right? In a perfect way, had to spring from a virgin background, right? That would eventually have to say, hopefully self-preserve, because it was all one within itself. Now, the interesting aspect of this is that in the fall, say, is where traditionally you would have had the separation between men and woman, right? And so, while the union between men and woman was necessary through their coupling, right, their actual procreation and so on, this was still, in a sense, the product of the fall. It was something. It's the same concept of Adam and Eve feeling guilty about their nudity after they were overthrown from heaven. That's the actual reminiscence of that, aside from the fact that the Bible tells things in different ways, but it's not really to be intended in an absolute sense. Rather, what that difference was, because the man and let's say the male and the feminine principle were present always in the full completion, right? But the sense is that in order to transcend the world, you had to get to a point in which you reunited the entire world in one. And so, even speaking of sexual difference, that at that point would have come back all to the one, was admitting still that there was a trace of fallen nature in it. So it may seem machinous in this perspective, but it is really how this care also not to exceed sexually was really taken to consideration for. And we know also what pre-industrial societies looked like. We have really documented them extensively. Like, there is an appalling misery, right? The level of incest, the level of of promiscuity, etc., with all what comes with the ignorance of it, is not really what the ultimate. It's like Roland not thinking about his beloved one who was crying for him back home, but about his own sword that he loved more than her. So it may seem so strange and even borderline, like there is something weird here, I have to understand what it is, but you can never understand it fully if you do not understand even. And I should make videos perhaps about, say, sexual tradition. We can use this term properly, and so how we should see that highest purpose of possession and coming back to the one beyond the mere material act per se. That is evidently an issue, right? If you think about it, it's even ridiculous, right? It doesn't matter how beautiful it is, but it expresses that sense, of course, of unfulfillment. That is just one true instant, and that has to also literally create a new life, which is another deal entirely at that point, and that therefore has it's a miracle, and it should be treated as such, as opposed to concentrating just on the sexual aspect per se. So again, we will keep talking about this perhaps better in another video. In any case, Otto Cluny, that was the biographer of Gerard Yak, say that there was nothing more excellent in that sort of capacity of taming the lower instincts as opposed to the highest will that must materialize traditionally in marriage, also of course through union, through reproduction, but that it is for the human condition ipso facto also one of still the reminders that we are limited and that we need that in order to be complete. All right, which I think is a huge deal. In fact, Aldo said nothing is to be compared to virginity. Right? Ask any person today. I can't say that objectively. Yes, I would have done. I think without any regrets. Without sex, if I could find the only woman I want to spend my life, a lifetime of love with, and I really think about it, like what were those other relationships for? Yes, you can be curious. You're brought up in this world that was not excessively, let's say, a libertine, but of course I understand what's the interest, what's the say the broader point, right? But in fact, there is even a broader one that revolves around what about loving only one woman for your entire life? That sounds pretty cool, right? And it goes beyond saying, okay, I want to have sex every day. It's two different things. It's not that you can't have both, but at the same time, there is another end goal, which is the rising of a family, and so a set of beliefs and capacities that are not definitely revolving around sex. Even so, that's the order of thought that we should enter it. And of course, you couldn't quite simply verify these things at the time, nor today. I mean, people can be very open about their sex life today, but at the time it was just in itself a matter of, it's a big deal, and you may never know, right? What was also the actual level of social control. It's very difficult to even to historically reconstruct what was going on. We can't just imagine in general, comparatively more. Going briefly back to Drythelm's vision of purgatory and heaven, the angel that accompanied him had reminded Drythelm that suffering souls could be helped by the prayers, but also by alms and fasting, as much as masses. Of course, all things that you would do in life. It was very important to intercede for others, and to be interceded by others. Alms givings, fasting, were thought really in that collective fashion, not less than masses, right? Lenten sermon stressed the theme, for it is written, as water extinguishes fire, so alms extinguish sin. And of course there was a broader purpose of alms, that is the one of balancing out the sort of injustice, right? The idea that those who made more at the top were, I'd say, influencing more those at the bottom proportionally. And so, yes, they were doing something great, but also at a cost. In the sense was that every person should give to the poor according to what he possesses. And this is interesting because it's not just like everybody was poor technically. It was understood that the fringe was important to be won over, as long as it there were really many, say the poor were not like the poor we see today. There were many, at least in some parts of the world, it can even be the most developed depending on the sort of divides that exist within society and how wealth is distributed. But the idea was that the poor was to be helped so that you could redeem them. That nobody was really beyond redemption. So if these had been poor because they had failed in a sense to receive God's grace in terms of personal accomplishment, they could be given a chance, right? It was a redemptional value, of course, to this help, and this was to be appreciated, of course, and especially through the church that administered this wealth. Had been run in the Xenodokia historically. It was just this mega welfare system that before was in the hands of the state and now was, deputed to this de facto independent reality within the same Christendom, at least in terms of ecclesiastical property and clergy just per se. Even this was substantially different from reality in a way. Many churches grew extremely wealthy in the pious donations. If we think about alms, assisting the donors' souls, it's been estimated that around 3/4 of the approximately 800 original charters dating from the centuries in the Swabian Abbey of St. Gall and preserved in the local archive, grants made for the health of the soul, right? So this was in a way an alm to allow the church to be preaching, to be officiating. So it wasn't not just simple subsistence for the poor, but it would sort of translate itself in such. It was important to have a well-administered community to rule on, in general, a satisfied one that could, where of course you could increase control through the elites, which is occurring in these very centuries, but to the broader purpose of this elite making order within the same, and so maybe widening the gap between them and the rest of the people, but also and definitely helping moving that community in a more uniform, say common and coherent direction. And this is really what stands out. Alcuin urged a noblewoman and her daughter, quote, that feeding of the hungry is the salvation of the rich. Because again, these rich people said, well, but we achieved this, why should we are the better ones, why should we help the poor? Well, because without that you cannot quite have, at least to some degree of course, a stable society. You cannot have an equal society. You risk crystallizing an elite and making its foundation shattered, which did happen among some people. So the process of redistribution of wealth was actually pretty much out there since ever. Like, we would be surprised in this sense how much of a fairer welfare system than today's existed, not because the people got more necessarily, but because there was a greater sense of what was really the misery of the world, and how it was important to fix that, in spite of the fact that, of course, it was a much poorer world than the one we know today. So that should make us think, because every society always had a degree of welfare, right? Except course, it could vary in the way it was distributed, and the let's say that a compact society in which you would pay the church for dealing with this, say, absorbing the poor elements, and also give them a job, right? Or a place where to work, right? Even maybe to a condition approximating the one of serfdom, but still, right, cultivating them, giving them a task, a potential point, was much more important than how we see today. People should disappear. No, they should really be working, right? And it's difficult to make it so. There were all kind of people at the time as well, and in a sense, the situation again was even more messed up than we think in terms of pressure and difficulties, but this was seen as, again, a way to hold society together, not to make society weak or too unbalanced, and especially in front of the enemies, and so the more compact society was, the more successful politically it could be. Somebody preached, there was a preacher warning his congregation not to retain for their own use the food that they had saved by fasting during Lent. Right, truly understanding the meaning of that and the value of it, right? They were urged to be sure to distribute it to the poor later. Fasting and almsgiving could be performed in a spirit also of self-gain. There are interesting documents showing how, for example, there were people seizing somebody else's property and pretending to receive alms, right? And this is, evidently an injustice, as they should show mercy to some, but oppressing others at the same time. Emphasis on almsgiving as a religious activity acknowledged and in practice reinforced the necessity of a social order. It was also very stratified, as you understand, in which, again, the nobility and the clergy played a quite important role. They had their own hierarchy. Nobility doesn't mean clergy correspondence. It was the higher clergy that had a bit the same role, but there were the smaller milites that had the same role at the level, say, a local priest could do. So it was, of course, a highly corporatistic society in many ways, required by the circumstance. There was early medieval teaching on the relationship of all people to God, lay in fear of judgment and damnation in face of this striking presence of sin, right, and of evil, of malevolence, and more. And one could simply say, well, but, the world should work like this, but it doesn't. Bad things happen because people do them, and so somebody must act in order to fix the situation. And in this climate, a penitential discipline of monastic origin came to pervade norms of lay conduct. We're talking about almsgiving, intercessory prayer, or penance helped one person towards salvation, and this necessarily involved the presence of other people. The struggle for salvation was fought, and it must be fought within the arena of the community. Because without that, right, and that's where either you abandon the community or you are into it. And so there's no other way out. It's the same reason why you cannot receive the Holy Ghost if you do not receive communion. And that requires that community life in the first place. So it's interesting to think about this stuff also from a practical point of view, because what is the ultimate purpose of this broader say, mechanisms and all the evidence of all these interventions, if they had no practical purpose, if they were not important, if they hadn't really been so relevant and functional, this is very difficult to ask, right? In any case, we will keep seeing this aspect of Christian life. I really urge you to look at this history, because it's way more fascinating than it seems. Sometimes it could be more theoretical in explanation, sometimes it can be more concrete, but there is always a reason that must be found, and that was readily evident to them, right, even in the shortcomings, that is virtually unknown to us, and that we can recuperate through this attention towards the past. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.